Hey everybody, it's Pastor Adam. Just wanted to come on briefly before we get started with this podcast with Brian McLaren that we had a little bit of technical difficulties. Brian's video shut down during the conversation twice, so I edited that out for this recording so that you don't have to deal with waiting for it. So if there's a little bit of choppiness in the conversation, that is why that's the case, but this was so much fun for me. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. So here it is. One question with Pastor Adam, with Brian McLaren, about his latest book called Do I Stay Christian?
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Clackamas United Church of Christ and the Pastor Adam Facebook pages. This is One Question with Pastor Adam, and I am Adam, and I am pastor to believers and doubters, to unfaithful Christians and faithful atheists. And friends, Jesus wasn't afraid of questions, and neither are we here at One Question with Pastor Adam. And so each week on Thursdays, sometimes at 11, today at 12 Pacific, we are going to talk about questions that you have, questions that you've sent me over Facebook or Instagram about faith and doubt and science and politics and all the things. And today I am so excited because we have one of my, you shouldn't have favorites, right? But he's one of my favorites. His name is Brian McLaren, and Brian came out with a new book. It is a question that so many of us are asking, that I'm asking, that I know that you are asking too. The question is, do I stay Christian? And Brian has just come out with this book. I've read all through it, and it's fantastic. So I'm going to bring Brian in and talk about it. But before I do, Brian really needs no introduction, but Brian was a pastor for 24 years. He's now writing books, going on tour, talking with people. In the pandemic, he was doing the Zoom thing. And so we are just so lucky, fortunate, blessed to have Brian with us. Hi, Melanie. And I want to let you know, if you've got questions, what are you struggling with in Christianity and keeping your faith? Have you let it go? Why did you do that? If you have, why do you stay? If you have comments that you'd like to make, I invite you to bring those in. So hi, Dia from the Netherlands. Always good to see you, Dia. So here is Brian. I was telling you, Brian, before we went live that every time I see Brian, I throw like a party inside of my body because it's always just so good to see Brian. So Brian, thank you for being here.
Well, thanks. And I'm really happy I titled my book with a question so it would fit so well with your podcast.
That was good planning, Brian. Thank you for that. That's perfect. Brian, one of the things that I just love about you is your gentle nature, and it comes through in your book so well as you're dealing with these questions. And one of the things, as we're talking about it, I just want to point out one of the reasons that so many people, when I'm talking with them, stay Christian is because of this guy, Jesus, who, when we're having these like really difficult conversations, these struggles, political struggles with other people who are Christians, and all of these other, like science, all of these things we're going to get into in this conversation, you have a way of dealing with it in such a gentle way that is really a good model for me for how to love people on the other side. And we're going to be talking about people on the other side. And really towards the end of your book, you really get into like, your book is broken up into 3 parts to answer the question, do I stay Christian? Yes, no. How do I live? No matter how I answer those questions. And in the how do you live part, you do a great job of being gentle with the other while staying firm and resisting the toxicity that we see. And I wanted to start out with my question. How do you do that, Brian? Because you do it so well.
Well, I mean, so many things you find yourself doing, you just realize it's the way your life sort of took you, and you hope the Spirit has prepared you and guided you and brought you along in that path somehow. But I am not by nature a fighter. You know, when I was a kid, everybody thought of me as the nature guy or the music guy. I was a sort of a creative person. I wasn't a fighter, a polemicist, or argumentative person. So it's kind of my nature. But what ended up happening is I became a pastor, and I started realizing that the Christian faith that I thought was centered on Jesus, who was a guy who didn't kill anybody, hate anybody, torture anybody, shame anybody. I started realizing the religion is going in a different direction, or major sectors of the religion are going in a different direction. And I've realized that I either have to go along with it, or or pretend, or I have to speak up. So I suppose, you know, I'm glad if I manifest a gentle spirit. It's what I feel I have inside, but I'm also angry, and I'm, you know, I'm feel like I'm fiercely involved in this very dangerous moment. And so putting those together, I suppose, has just in some ways flowed from my own story. The only other thing I'll say is that many years ago, I realized that what's the saying? If you fight fire with fire, everybody gets burned. Or if you go eye for eye, tooth for tooth, everybody's blind, and nobody can eat corn on the cob. So,
Yeah.
So when you realize that there are ways to respond that make things worse, it challenges you to say, how can I learn habitually to respond that doesn't just create vicious cycles that perpetuate the very problems that I'm upset about?
That's good. Well, we're going to talk about the problems. And I ended up posting on my social media, what are reasons that you left Christianity? What are reasons that you stay? And why does this matter to you? And I got a lot of responses. And I want to bring up one of those responses, which is from Joshua. Joshua lays the hammer down right in the beginning. And as I read your book, I went into it thinking that you were going to just kind of talk about some of the bad things in Christian history. You're going to wash over them and get to the point where, yeah, this is why you should stay Christian. But you don't do that. You take the ugly so seriously. And by the time that I was done with, these are the reasons that you should say no, I was almost having a faith crisis. I was almost like, I'm a Christian. I'm going to stay Christian. I'm going to read this book. And I know what Brian's going to say already, but Brian, you like lay the hammer down in that no section. And it's so real. It's so raw. It's so honest. And it's one of the things that I love about your book, because we have to be serious about the problems that we're facing within Christianity. So here is Joshua. Go ahead and respond if you want, but Joshua lays it out here as well. So if you want to respond to that, you can go ahead and do it.
No, go ahead. Let's hear from Joshua.
Here's Joshua. I left for many reasons: the deliberate push to influence local, state, and national politics, the divisive, authoritarian, Christo-fascist rhetoric espoused by so many of its leaders and followers, their belief that the U.S. is a Christian nation and religious freedom equates to imposing their beliefs on others, including those of different faiths, the astounding number of racists, bigots, and abusive leadership, the perpetuation of misogyny, thus maintaining the societal role of patriarchy, its warped idea of morality that's based on instilling fear of retribution, the prosperity gospel grift, the asinine claims by many of persecution due to their beliefs, the overt action taken to control women, the standard practice of covering up sexual abuse, just to name a few. Joshua laying the hammer down. And then, Brian, you quoted Gandhi earlier, or referenced the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. We're all going to go blind, and we can't eat corn on the cob anymore. Disasters. He says, I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. that was like a summary of all of the comments that I got. So I thought we might go through some of them just by talking about how other people put it as well. But just your initial thoughts. I mean, it resonates so well with what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like he could have written this book.
Yes.
Or at least the first third of it he could have written. And he's naming real problems, and they're interrelated. That word Christo-fascist that he used, I don't know when I first heard it, but I remember the first time I heard it, I thought, that's a thing. That's a way to name something. And it's becoming more and more overt, and it's a thing. One of the things I say in the book, as you know, is that I think in the coming years, we should expect Christianity to not be one thing. It isn't one thing now. In many ways, it has never been one thing. It has been many things simultaneously, and many of those things are contradictory. But I think we should expect the worst forms of Christianity to get worse and worse. I think we should also expect, because this is happening, that in response to that, we'll see better expressions of Christianity than we've seen in a very, very long time. And I think what's going to happen is the people in the middle are going to get pulled in one direction or the other. I don't think there'll be too much of a middle. I also just make one other one little comment. He talked about Christians influencing politics. And here's the interesting thing. It's Christians influencing politics against everything Christ stood for. Like if Christians were influencing politics in the direction of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness, self-control, I think people would say, we're really glad those Christians are involved in politics.
Yes.
But when they're influencing politics to say, let's have more guns, let's destroy the earth even faster, let's return to our old ways of racism, bigotry, apartheid, Jim Crow. So there it is. And it's these opposite things that are happening. And I suppose when a lot of people say they want to leave Christian faith, I want to say, if that's what Christian faith, if that's the only option for Christian faith, of course you have to leave it if you're a person of good conscience.
Please do leave it. Yes, if that's all we got. But that's not all we got. Luke here says, and I'm going to read it first from Kevin. Kevin's got some swagger in this comment. And this is like why I'm going to stay. And I don't want to avoid the why I'm going to stay, because we can just stay on the negative the whole time. Kevin says, they'll pry my Jesus from my hashtag cold dead hands.
Yes.
He says, I'm going to fight to take that identity back. They've already dragged his name far enough into the mud by connecting his church to the money-loving, war-mongering, capital-worshipping right wing. And Kevin is here to take it back. And I love that swagger. Luke in the comments says, we need to press on and forward like goddamn warriors. Now, Luke is anti-violence. He's using violent language as metaphors here and referring to Clint Eastwood's they'll pry the gun from my cold dead hands, right?
Yes.
This is kind of what Luke and Kevin are here doing is subverting this kind of violent language in order to point to the non-violent Christ, including as you talked about, there's a little anger here too, including the Christ who goes into the temple and sees injustice happening and gets people out of the temple, right? So I like the swagger, and I see the swagger in you. I see the swagger in your book. There are reasons to hold on to this.
And focusing on Jesus is the most central thing we can do, to say, I actually think Jesus was right. I actually think Jesus was good. I actually think Jesus was really smart. And I actually think Jesus was going in the right direction. So much so that I would like to live in that direction, follow that direction myself. Now, if I do that, then I've got to say and do what Jesus said and did in the manner that Jesus said and did it. And And here's where we have this great challenge going forward. I'm not a big quoter of Nietzsche, the German philosopher. I mean, he was brilliant and complicated and tortured. But one of the things he said that is very, very true, I think, is he said, beware when fighting the monster, lest you become the monster. And you and I both know that there's this tendency in human beings to mirror what it is that they engage with. So somebody's nasty to you, you want to be nasty to them. When an adult and a temper tantruming 3-year-old get into an argument, it has never happened that the 3-year-old has acted like an adult. So you're easily brought down to the level of the people who you're opposing. And this is one of the great challenges for us moving forward. And that doesn't mean there is no place for anger. There is every place for anger. It doesn't mean it's a time to be milquetoast and moderate. No, it's a time to be courageous, bold, firm. The word I use in the book is defiant. But that defiance doesn't have to be hateful. There is such a thing as a gracious defiance. There's such a thing, could we say it this way? There's such a thing as a humble swagger, meaning it's not like I'm going to bring my ego into this and get my ego up against your ego. It's a way to say, I'm not living out of my ego. I'm not living out of my concern for my reputation. I'm trying to live out of something else. And that's what Jesus seemed to have the ability to do.
I love it. I love it. So we'll get into some of the particular issues that you bring up. The first one is anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Christianity's from nearly the very beginning has an anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish ring to it, and ring to it is probably not strong enough of a word to use it, especially as we continue to see today anti-Semitism coming up. You have been at marches in places where white supremacists have been, who have said the Jews will not replace us. These are people in,
and we should say I was there as a counter protest against the people saying that.
Yes. And so you've witnessed this kind of hate firsthand. It's been there in Christian history. That's one reason to leave. Can you talk a little bit more about the anti-Semitic virus that has been there from very early?
I put it first because it's the one that shows up earliest in Christian history of the issues that I named. It shows up by the end of the first century. And this is totally understandable and totally inexcusable. That a religion started by a Jew, all of the original followers were Jews, become anti-Jewish. And by the way, there's a lesson in this for us, because you could say, Jesus comes along with an idea, a good idea, and many of the leaders of his religious community reject it and reject him. So then those people define themselves as enemies of that community, and they become hateful enemies of that community. And in that way, they betray Jesus. Do you see? They define themselves by their enemy. They define themselves by putting themselves in opposition. They forget what they're for, and they become against something. And they become against something that they can project all of their own shadow and all of their own anxiety and all the rest upon. And the results go on for centuries. And it's horrible. Since I wrote the book, I discovered things I'd never known before. I'm going to be speaking in England next month. I never knew until recently that England kicked out all Jews for a couple hundred years. I never knew that. And so this anti-Jewish trend in Christianity, it goes early, it goes deep, and it has, I mean, if people want to do some reading on the subject, it will chill you to the bone. And that's why I wrote that chapter first. And people have asked me, since reading the book, they say, which of the 10 reasons is most significant? And I kind of feel like saying, it's like, I mean, any one of them would do. To say that the status quo is not worth sustaining unless it faces and turns from these elements of Christian history. But man, that very first one is one that just makes me sick.
Yeah. And the reason that Jesus goes into the temple is because he's got Jewish models or Hebrew models. Like he's quoting the Hebrew prophets. Jesus is fully within the line of Judaism as he's critiquing Judaism. Right.
Yes.
And nobody, go ahead.
And he's not doing it to hurt Judaism. He's doing it to help his fellow Jews. One way to say it, I'm not claiming that I have the inside track in Jesus' psychology, but as somebody who's loved Jesus my whole life and spent a lot more time than most people reading everything I can read about Jesus and other things we could say. But I think Jesus, as a young man of 30 years old, looks around and says, and he realized, just as I said about Christianity, that there are many Christianities and they do opposite things. He realized there are many Judaisms and they're doing opposite things. And he realized that unless we find a different way to live, we're on a suicidal trajectory. So he wasn't saying it because he hated his religion he was saying it because he loved them and didn't want them to keep going down a suicidal path. And that's very much how I feel about the Christian faith in its many expressions today.
It's, when you critique Christianity, our history, I'm sure that there are people who say that you just hate your religion, that you should just, it's like this America, love it or leave it thing. Christianity, love it or leave it thing. You love it and you critique it because you love it. That's what Jesus was doing. That's what you're doing. And that's what so many of us are doing. And it's a way of claiming how it can be better. And you go into politics pretty quickly as well. Lizzie says this: I don't call myself a Christian anymore. I had a rough road coming to Christianity, and then it got worse when Trump came into play. You talk about Trump in your book, and she says, I still focus. Michael says this: the reason that I stay is I still focus on God and Christ and find a social media to be a place where she can connect with other Christ followers. Social media gets a bad rap, but for so many of us, it's especially if we're living in certain areas of the country or the world, it can be the only place where we find other, for lack of a better term, progressive Christians who are on this journey as well. Right. But can you talk about, politics came up over and over again. Sharon says that her struggle is that many Christians are depriving people of basic civil liberties. We've got many people trying to take trans rights away from people. Right now, we've got the women and abortion, those of us with uteruses not being able to get abortions. BN talks about racism that's infected Christian politics. Eileen talks about colonialism, something that you spend a lot of time in in your book. And Murray talks about what we were talking about earlier, like Christ would help the poor. Christ wants us to help the poor. And yet so much of Christian politics claims to be pro-life and is against policies that actually help children and their families, calling them freeloaders. So there's a lot of anger underneath this, as you're talking about, a lot of criticism of what Christianity is most known for, because the loudest people in the political Christian realm are doing anti-Christ things, it looks like to us.
Yes. And I'm in this situation where I want to say two things that might seem opposite, but I mean them both. The first is people have every reason to be angry. They have every reason to be angry. If you're not angry, you're not paying attention. Anger is to the soul or to consciousness what pain is to the body. when you put your hand on a hot stove, you don't have to think about it. Your body reacts and you pull your hand away because your body says, don't keep experiencing tissue destruction, and anger is a reaction, and it's a forceful reaction because it says something is happening here that's dangerous and wrong. And I have to have so anger is reactive. It really is. But then comes the challenge of beware in fighting the monster that you do not become the monster. So what can we do with our anger that brings us to a better place, whether you stay Christian or not? And one of the temptations is to think, because I'm angry at people who do bad things, that makes me a good person. It might be a first step. But we got to go farther than that. Anger is a good first step, but how are we going to keep moving? And that's what I hope we can do from facing this. Because here's the thing. This in no way lets Christianity off the hook. The Christian religion has a unique set of problems, and it has 2,000 years of history that is available for people to see how those problems are related to certain Christian ideas and practices and so on. But guess what? Human beings have a really unique set of problems. And I have a feeling that at the core of a lot of the things we're angry about is a tendency in human beings, a weakness, a flaw in our evolution. I don't mean flaw like we used to be perfect and we stepped down. I mean like we're just not that mature yet. And here's one way to describe it. We are very susceptible to lies, and we're very susceptible to authoritarians who tell lies. And we're very susceptible to people who use shame to manipulate us. And once we know that, then we say, oh, that's how that works out in Christianity. That's how that works out in American politics. That's how that works out in Russian politics. That's how that works out in Brazil. That's how that works out in Afghanistan. And we start to see, oh, these are human phenomena out there. And what we have to pay attention to at some point is, what kind of human beings do we want to be? Because you can get rid of Christianity and still have those human problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I I hesitate to say this because I have many atheist friends, especially in the last couple of years, and many of them are kind and gentle and want me to be the best Christian that I can be.
Yes.
And I love it. And then there are others who are like, you Christians are so arrogant and awful, and you need to just not be Christians anymore, and you need to be like us, and then the world will be so much better. And I'm like, do you see how you're mirroring the same arrogance that you hate?
Yeah.
The Nietzsche, the monsters that you hate is what you are becoming. That's the human problem.
Yeah. And we're all susceptible to this. So that's right. That's right. And this is one of the problems with labels, isn't it? Whether you're defining yourself by the beliefs that you have or the beliefs that you reject, if you think having or rejecting a set of beliefs makes me a good person, my goodness, it's not quite that simple. And let me say one other thing. It might be easier for folks in America to see this if we remember after September 11th, when there was this resurgence of Islamophobic behavior and hateful behavior toward Muslims. And any of us who have friends who are Muslims were caught in this conundrum. Yes, on the news, there are a bunch of guys shouting Allahu Akbar when they're blowing up people and when they're shooting people. They're praising God when they're shooting people. And we see that, but we have friends who are Muslims who are some of the most wonderful people we've ever met. And so we realize that there are some people who only see the bad and other people have only experienced the good, and holding that together. And this is one of the things that is true in the Christian religion too. Some of the worst, well, the way I start the book is I say, nobody is born a religious jerk. It takes a religion to make them that way. Some of them, the biggest jerks I've ever met are Christian, But guess what? Some of the most wonderful human beings I've ever met who just, I'm in their presence and I feel like I'm uplifted and my world gets bigger. Yeah, they're Christian too. And there are Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus that we could just say, yeah, there is no shortcut to being that kind of person.
Yeah. I want to get into the Bible.
Yes.
The Bible, Jeff here says, as the meme I saw today from the Clergy Network said, Satan used the Bible to tempt Jesus. Satan can be in those trying to use the Bible today. The Bible is fraught with difficulty in interpreting it. And we've seen this throughout Christian history. And some other folks, Sharon says that she struggles with the Bible. Why must we take scripture written by man so literally? Yeah. Madeline says, my biggest issue is with the interpretation of the Old Testament and twisting scripture to manipulate people as they are. I also struggle with the New Testament for similar issues. Yeah. How so? The Bible, as we all know, can be weaponized against certain people. We'll talk a little bit more about those of us who identify as LGBTQIA2+ a little later. But just kind of, how do you see the Bible as the Word of God? As Sharon says, it's written by man. That's a big issue for Christianity today. How do you see the Bible? How do you see ways of interpreting it that are faithful to it, faithful to Jesus? Probably is the bigger question. How do you interpret Scripture in a way that we don't weaponize it against others, and yet we stay faithful?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd tell people is there are problems with the Bible, but there are way more problems with what people say about the Bible. In other words, we can't even deal with problems in the Bible till we deal with the problems, the assumptions that people bring to the Bible. So, for example, people talk about the Bible in the category of revelation, that it reveals something. And I'd say, absolutely, it reveals something. But if you say it only reveals God, what God wants to say and do, I'd have to say, well, no, the Bible reveals, might reveal something about God, but it also reveals some pretty horrible things that come from human beings too. A great example of this is one of the really interesting books in the Bible. It's the book of Job. And the book of Job is this book about human suffering, which is an enigma and conundrum for everybody, right? And we could have a whole discussion about that. But what happens in the book of Job is there's a man with a horrible problem, and then his friends come around and they start quoting Bible to him and saying all these religious, pious things to him. And at the end of the book of Job, God comes along and says, all your friends are a bunch of arrogant blowhards who don't know what they're talking about. None of them have spoken the truth the way you have, Job. And all Job could say is, I can't accept what you're saying. I can't accept what you're saying. You're wrong. I can't accept what you're saying. And so God basically sides with the guy who disagreed with the guys who are quoting the Bible. So if that doesn't show you in the Bible itself, the Bible is honest about these struggles. So I would say it's revelatory of the human condition, really, really in a powerful way. And I think we can learn something about God in that process, but it's not a simple straight line. It often involves deep thinking. In another part of the Bible, the book of Proverbs, it says the most important thing is wisdom, it's understanding, but don't be a fool. A fool thinks you can just find wisdom and understanding easily. No. A wise person knows you have to dig for it. You can't just listen to the first thing that one person says. You have to listen to many different voices if you're going to get wisdom. I mean, that's there in the Bible, but people act like fools. Exactly. So here's the thing I'd say to people. Was it Josh, the person who had the first comment that you read to me?
Yes. Yeah.
Josh mentioned patriarchy and authoritarianism. And one of the things we have to understand is that the Bible has become a tool of control. In other words, it's a beautiful and good thing that autocratic, authoritarian people have used to keep other people under control. And if you let them define it, I think you're giving them too much. So I think we have to get the Bible back.
So I love that you said that, because this is one of the pushbacks that I got in the comments, which was the Bible was written precisely to control people.
I don't know who would say that. There might be parts of the Bible that would be that way. I mean, obviously, it's written to influence people, but I mean, we're having this conversation to influence people. Whoever wrote that comment is trying to influence people. It's why we communicate. We're trying to engage in conversation and exchange influence, right? But that's different from control. And so much of the Bible is written by people who were under other people's control. It's a book. Most of the Bible is a book of the oppressed. It's literature of the oppressed. And so, in some ways, it's true. There are parts of the Bible that are trying to inspire oppressed people to not succumb to their oppression. If you want to call that control, I guess you could.
I think that is so important, because what a lot of people, what many people think, is that the Bible was written maybe by an oppressed Jewish group, Hebrew group, but within that, it was written by the powerful, the priests,
see, this is exactly when I mentioned the book of Job. This is what's so interesting, because what Job does is take sayings that we find in the book of Deuteronomy and uses them to oppress Job. And so here's what I love about the Bible. It's this library of texts that are in argument with one another. They're in tension with one another. And so the person who made this comment, I think, is really right in this way, that people who interpret the Bible and teach the Bible frequently use it to control people. There is no doubt about that. But the interesting thing about the Bible itself, I think, is if you really delve into it, and not just the oppressor's version of it, you find out that there are things in there that undo oppression very, very powerfully. And there are other things that you could quote to support oppression. Look, it's in our history.
Yep.
It was people using the Bible who justified slavery for 300 years. And it was people using the Bible who opposed slavery. Same Bible, they just chose different passages and different methods of interpretation. And one of the really chilling things, to me, this is one of the most chilling things of my entire life, is to realize that among people who love the Bible, there has been no serious reflection among the masses. Only among a very few scholars, there's been no serious reflection on how the Bible was used to justify slavery, so that the church would come together and say, we have a moral responsibility never, ever, ever to use the Bible that way again. Hasn't happened.
Right. Yeah.
Needs to happen.
And this brings me, thankfully, we decided that slavery is a bad thing, and we're not going to do that anymore, except we are doing it because the 13th Amendment allows for continued slavery. So we still even have work to go when it comes to slavery, but the same principles of promoting slavery or allowing slavery or thinking it's a good thing are the same principles today that other people are upset about, that Christianity is known for, which is being homophobic. If you're Christian, you are necessarily homophobic. And Michael has a comment here in the live show. Michael, I missed your comment, but it was something like how Michael has been, told that he is inferior, unloved because of who God made him to be. And here it is. I've been kicked in the teeth so many times by so-called Christians, but I'm living my true life as an out and proud gay man. Exclamation mark. Thank you, Michael. That's good. Ain't no stopping me now. Come on. There's the swagger that we're talking about. There's the I am staying Christian because this is who God made me to be. And dang it, God loves me. And this is what we're doing. And so Murray says that she talks about how when she was in high school, a friend hesitated to come out to her because Murray was Christian. And her friend said, I couldn't come out to you because you would have to hate me because Christians have to hate gay people.
Yes.
How do we deal with this form of toxicity within? Oh no, we lost Brian. Hopefully Brian will come back. There we go. Now we're back. Awesome.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there. I still could hear you, but I just disappeared.
Okay, good.
I had to pinch myself and see if I still was,
That's awesome. Well, I'm glad we fixed that easily. So we've got the homophobic reading of Scripture.
Yes.
And I know that you've had to deal with this on many different levels.
Yes.
So how do we deal with this in Christianity?
Yeah. So I think what we have to say is, so I have 4 adult children, and 2 of my children are LGBTQ. So, and I have members of my family who, and close friends in every one of those letters and in between. So this is a huge part of my life. And the first thing I want to say is I'm really glad that my kids and other gay people I know and love are alive now, and they weren't alive 100 years ago. I'm glad they weren't alive in, biblical times. They would not have had in all likelihood, they would not have had a good life, not only in Jewish settings or Roman settings or Greek settings or Germans. You know what I mean? There weren't many places. There were some maybe that would have a place and a way for people to be who they are. But for a lot of history, it wouldn't have been good, and not just in the Christian religion, but it's like it's taken. There are reasons that we could go into that I think it has to do with patriarchy. It has to do with the way that powerful men create systems of domination, and men who don't fit in with those systems, women who don't fit in with those systems, become problematic to authoritarian leaders. There's so much we could say about this, but you read Acts chapter 8 in the New Testament. 8 chapters into the book of Acts, 8 chapters, we meet a guy who is, first of all, he's not white, he's not Middle Eastern, he is African, he's Ethiopian. Second, he is not a traditional binary person of male, female. He has a sexually complex identity. And he has obviously a deep spirit to him, and he is accepted in the early Christian community, and he's baptized without any committee meetings, without any discussion. It's there from the beginning. And so what you have to say is this movement began as a scandalously inclusive movement, and it wasn't that they were embarrassed of it. They were ready to tell the story of how scandalously inclusive they were. And patriarchy resurged and reinforced sub-Christian behavior.
Yeah. Speaking of patriarchy, the other big one is the misogyny
Yes.
that we were pointed to at the beginning from Joshua. Hillary says that to talk about the patriarchal brainwashing of the church and how women are silenced. The rage that Hillary feels about the church for silencing of women's voices can be overwhelming for Hillary. And this is still in like the biggest Christian bodies is we have the silencing of women, and hopefully there's major progression towards that. But you talk about 2 Catholic nuns in your story who are in the struggle for this, and maybe whatever your thoughts are on the misogyny within the church and those 2 women, if you want to talk about them at all. But
again, it's once you look at this in the New Testament, you definitely can find some misogynist texts in the New Testament. And by the way, I really appreciated the person earlier who said they were disturbed by ways people interpret the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because of my concern about anti-Semitism, I try not to use the term Old Testament anymore. I talk about the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures. And when people say the problems are in the Old Testament, it is a way that unintentionally can reinforce anti-Semitic assumptions. Here's what I'd like to say about the Hebrew scriptures. There are arguments in the Hebrew scriptures. There are people who say, reject anyone who's a Gentile, and other people who say God loves Gentiles too. Gentile lives matter. That's an argument. And in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 8, a gay person is welcomed. And in Romans chapter 1, there are statements that are very easily used against gay people. Now, there's argument about whether that's the way to interpret them. But all I'd say is there's arguments. There's arguments. And we have to take sides in the argument. Yeah. We have to learn why there'd be an argument, try to understand the argument. And then we have to say, well, how am I going to live? That's what happened to me. I had to take a side. I think I think we do that in large part based on our view of God, and we get our view of God from many different sources, from our denomination, from our parents. We could say we get it from the Bible, but it has to do with how we interpret the Bible, because the Bible has arguments about what God is like too.
Yes.
And
yeah. You've talked about Deuteronomy. There's I think it's in Deuteronomy 23 or somewhere, where it says that no eunuch is allowed into the temple to worship, right?
That's right.
So there you go. The Bible says it. Well, guess what? In Isaiah says, hey, the day's coming very soon when eunuchs are going to be invited into the temple. Yes. Right. So this is the argument that you're talking about, that the Hebrew scriptures are having with what God is doing in the world. And please.
Could I make an analogy to something that's going on literally today? So we're having this conversation on a day when the Supreme Court has undercut a New York law for gun control. And so what the Supreme Court has said is that we have to go back and freeze the Constitution in time and make it absolute so that we can never limit the number of guns. Now, listen, when the Constitution was written, they didn't have AR-15s, right? Mm-hmm. It was a different world. And to take a text from that point and to say that we have to absolutize the words and pay no attention to the intent, pay no attention to the context, is exactly what religious people do with the Bible. And it takes something that could be seen as a great gift, and it turns it into a great threat and a great weapon.
Yeah, the argument that we have to take the Constitution, like the originalists, right, on the Supreme Court, who were like, we have the Constitution in its purest form back when it was first written. Well, guess what? That's an argument for bringing slavery back.
It sure is, and misogyny.
Yeah.
When the original Constitution was written, all men are created equal. It meant all white landowning men. It did not mean all women were created equal to men. It did not mean people, indigenous people. And so it's just, but we see it. It's playing out in our country the same way it plays out in religion. And again, we can be mad about it. It's a shame, but it's reality. It's what are we going to do about it? And one of the things we do is have conversations like this, where people can become more knowledgeable, more sophisticated, and more nuanced in the ways that they understand these things. And then we get to talk to our friends about it. And our friends get angry the first time we talk about it. And then we don't get angry back. We respond lovingly. And then we say, well, look, if you'd ever like to talk about it some more, we don't need to argue. I'm your friend. You don't have to agree with me. But if you're ever interested, I'd be glad to talk to you about it. And let's think it through, So that's how change happens. That's where we influence each other instead of controlling each other.
I love it. I love it. Dia says a scandalously inclusive movement. That's exactly what it was and what it should be. Beautifully
Yes.
said. So thank you for that, Brian. That could be a title of a book in the future, the scandalously inclusive gospel or movement or something. Okay. I know that you love science. Science is a topic that you have loved throughout your life. You write about your experience growing up in a church that was not so pro science as you were as a child. Talk to us a little bit. Science is a big issue for people, whether we stay or
Yes.
whether we go.
Yes.
So, what can you tell us a little bit about faith, religion, and science, Christianity, and science?
Yeah. Well, again, this is just a crazy thing that happened in Christian history, and it doesn't have to be this way, and it's not this way for everybody. But we had a group of people who held power because of the way they interpreted the Bible. They interpreted the Bible, they call it literally, but they interpret it in a way that helped the people in power stay in power. That's the thing to remember. And it wasn't really about science, it was about their power. See? And so the fact is, in fact, if you were to go to the early centuries, there's a couple of passages where St. Augustine, who's one of the early church intellectuals with whom I disagree on a whole lot of things, I think, but I acknowledge his brilliance. And I think he was a fascinating person trying to do the best he could. But Augustine just says, who are these buffoons who keep quoting the Bible when they should just look at how the world works? He was very much a pro-science guy, even though the category of science as we think of it didn't even exist yet in Augustine's time. But he's basically saying, don't quote the Bible when you should just go out and see how the world works. And so I think this is like, there's thousands, millions of us who say the Bible and science, the way you use the Bible does not put you in contradiction with science. And by the way, that's not a particularly new idea. If we were to go back, if anyone here is Methodist, John Wesley saw this trouble brewing, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And he said, look, we should take the Bible seriously. We should take reason seriously. We should take experience seriously and tradition or history seriously. Take all those things seriously. Don't just choose one and throw out the others.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so another topic that kept coming up over and over again that you've written a book about. I think it's called the word
Yeah.
after the last. What is that book?
The last word and the word after that. Yes.
Okay, so you have done a lot of work on hell.
Yes.
And helping us understand what hell is about, because another topic that Josh brings up in his comment, and that so many others brought up, was this fear factor of retribution.
Yes.
God may not get you today, but eventually God is going to get you, and you are going to burn in hell forever.
Yes.
And this gets connected with shaming others. It gets connected with Christian superiority over it. You have to be like us or you're going to burn in hell forever. Help us kind of briefly work through this concept of hell. And then people, please get this book that Brian,
the last word and the word after
wrote,
that.
But the last word and the word after that. So important.
And I should say, I have to drop off in about 4 minutes. So
so we got 4 minutes for hell.
It's terrible to solve the problem of hell in 4 minutes. But let me just say this. In the Hebrew scriptures, there is no concept of hell. In fact, there is no concept of afterlife. So every Christian should understand that in the entire first part of the Bible, if you believe God inspired that, God had no desire to teach the Jewish people that there was an afterlife, much less an idea of hell. It doesn't exist. If you find it in the King James Version, it's just a bad translation of the Hebrew word Sheol that just means the grave. So that's the first thing. I think the Jewish people were very smart and saw it was a dangerous idea in many of their neighboring peoples, the Assyrians, the Egyptians. They all had these sort of elaborate afterlife concepts that were used to scare people. Jesus comes along in between the end of the Hebrew canon or text of scripture and when Jesus is born. The idea of hell comes in probably from Zoroastrianism into a group of people called the Pharisees. They're the ones who accept that idea. the others don't. And by the way, Plato believed in hell. So there was a group called the Hellenists who were influenced by Plato. They had a different understanding of hell. I think what Jesus does is he takes that idea of hell and turns it on its head. He uses the idea of hell to deconstruct the assumptions of the people who are asking the question time and time and time again. And so, I think of Jesus. Well, let me just say, I wish we had a better way of dealing with the subject. But there it is. It's out there. It's in our history, not just Christianity. It's in fact, there's a Buddhist version of hell in Theravada Buddhism. But what I think so we can see how authoritarians abuse it. I think our opportunity is to say, how has it been abused? And what is the right use of the fear of real and present danger to help us change our behavior? And fear that makes us change our behavior to avoid terrible consequences is a very legitimate part of how human beings live and grow and change and behave. But when you put fear with the threat of retribution by God, it ends up polluting everything. And that's what the Christian religion has had way, way too much of. Thank God it's changing in many places, but there are many places it's as strong as ever.
I love it. Thank you, Brian, for this conversation. Friends, thank you for being here and for all of your comments. Again, the latest book is Do I Stay Christian? So many other books by Brian. If I were to recommend one book to start with from Brian, it would be whatever book you can get your hands on. So get this one, get whatever one. Brian, how can people keep up with you?
Well, my website's brianmclaren.net, and that has links to my Twitter and Facebook and so on.
Beautiful. Brian, thank you so much for being here. It is always a pleasure to be with you.
I am still
throwing a party inside of myself. So
well, keep up the great work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You too, my friend. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye. Friends, wow. Like Brian McLaren, just so good. So good. Man, it's always just so fun for me to talk with Brian. I hope you had a great time listening to Brian. We could have talked for so much longer. I think I got to all of the topics that I wanted to talk about. And we could have gone on for so much longer with the conversation about hell. And for me, one of the things that I think is so brilliant about what Jesus was doing with that concept was bringing it to the here and now. And I think Brian and I would have gotten to this if we had a little bit more time. But Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is among you. What Christianity ended up doing, and this is part of the problem with Christianity, is saying that heaven is something that you have to wait for after you die. And so this way of spiritualizing heaven has become a way of, somebody said it on one of my social media pages, was heaven has become a way of just sitting in your place. Just wait for things to get better after you die. So don't work for justice now. Don't work to make the world a better place because God wants you to just wait until after you die. And then things are going to be great. That's not Jesus. That's not the Bible. We were talking about how the Bible is actually written by an oppressed people who are working for a more just world. You get this in the story of the Exodus, right? This is the whole story where God hears the cry of the oppressed and God works for the oppressed to bring about freedom. Now, the rest of the Bible, including parts of that story, are how we end up getting caught in oppressive systems. God is always on the side of the oppressed. This is what liberation theology has taught us in the last generation, 30, 40, maybe 50 years now. And so it's this movement that is for justice right here, right now. So when Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is among you, it's here, it's now. Work for it, live into it now. And one of the places where Christianity gets wrong is when it just says, yeah, just wait till after you die. No, work for it now. That's what the prophets did. That's what Jesus is inviting us to. But if the kingdom of heaven is among us now, the realm of hell is among us now too. Where do we see hell in the world? It's in the places where these oppressive systems exist. And as I'm saying this, I'm recognizing that those oppressive systems have infected me. They've infected you, I'm sure, in some way. Those places of hell exist inside of ourselves as much as, and they exist outside of ourselves. So it's doing the work of naming, being aware of the hell systems that are right here, right now. Again, hell is not primarily about some place you go after you die. It's about what's happening right now in the world today. Melanie, I think I saw you talking about, I haven't seen the Supreme Court's decision on New York and guns, but Melanie, your comment makes me think that they decided that people can carry guns in New York if they want to carry guns in New York. So you're going to have people, as Melanie says, in subways next to people wondering if you there have a gun or not. This is the Wild West. This is hell on earth. This is going to create hell on earth. I hope I'm wrong. But as Christians, it's part of our job to start living into the realm of heaven here and now. However that looks to you, however you can bring a little bit of heaven here on earth now is part of the key. Related to this conversation, that challenge, that invitation, that kind of swagger that comes along with that in Jesus's life, as many of you have been putting in your comment sections, that kind of swagger is what I think we need more of. I'm here for that. So anyway, thank you everybody for being here. Jesus taught his Father was forgiveness. Yes, forgive. As we work for a more just world, let us live into that spirit of love and forgiveness that Jesus is getting at. So again, Dina says, brilliant man. Brian is brilliant. All of his books, excuse me. Sorry about that. All of his books are really great. Generous Orthodoxy may sound like a strange title to you, but that was the first Brian McLaren book that I read. I think that was in 2006, 2004, A Generous Orthodoxy. You might start with that one, but this one that he wrote today that we talked about is so good. Do I Stay Christian? A guide for the doubters, the disappointed, and the disillusioned. So, oh man, I just wish that I could talk to Brian forever and listen to him forever. So anyway, highly recommend the book. Friends, thank you for being here. Thank you for your comments. And I hope that you have a great rest of your day. You can catch One Question with Pastor Adam generally on Thursdays at 11 o'clock Pacific. And you can keep up with all of the episodes, including if you want more of Brian, I did an interview with him on his book before this, which is called The Great Spiritual Migration, another fantastic book from Brian. I was going to show you the book, but I only have the hardcover and I don't have the soft thing that goes, the flap thing that goes over it, the cover. So I'm just holding up a white book for you. Anyway, highly recommend The Great Spiritual Migration. You can check out my interview with Brian on that at One Question with Pastor Adam on the podcast, wherever you listen to your podcasts, you can check that out. So anyway, hope you have a great rest of your day. Plan to see you next Thursday at 11 o'clock Pacific for another episode of One Question with Pastor Adam. God be with you, friends. Take care.